What if the sky itself became a trap? Imagine hundreds of bombers filling the air, engines roaring, guns pointed outward, while one tiny mistake turns survival into chaos. This is not a movie scene. This is a real moment from history when two massive warplanes met in the air, locked together above the clouds, and forced their crews to face a choice between steel, fire, and empty sky. In the middle years of the Second World War, the sky above Europe no longer felt endless or peaceful, because it was crowded with machines built for destruction. Every morning, long before sunrise, American aircrews climbed into their aircraft knowing the air itself was a battlefield. The backbone of these missions was the B-17 Flying Fortress, a heavy bomber designed to fly far, carry enormous bomb loads, and endure damage that would destroy most planes. On major missions, these bombers did not fly alone. They rose into the air by the hundreds, assembling slowly into massive formations that stretched across the sky like moving cities of metal. From the ground, witnesses described the sound as thunder that never ended. Inside the formation, pilots stared at neighboring aircraft so close that they could see faces through cockpit glass. This closeness was intentional, because survival depended on unity. Every bomber carried multiple machine guns, and when flown in tight formation, their defensive fire overlapped, creating a deadly barrier against enemy fighters. But this strategy came with a terrible cost. There was almost no space to maneuver, no room for hesitation, and no margin for human error. One wrong movement, one sudden drop in altitude, or one moment of poor visibility could turn protection into catastrophe. In this crowded sky of steel, danger did not only come from the enemy below or behind. Sometimes, the greatest threat was flying just a few meters away. To understand how two bombers could collide in mid-air, it is necessary to understand why they flew so dangerously close in the first place. The formation system used by the United States Army Air Forces was not designed for comfort or safety, but for survival under constant attack. Each B-17 Flying Fortress was armed with multiple machine guns, but a single bomber on its own was an easy target for enemy fighter pilots. When bombers flew together in tight formations, their defensive firepower overlapped, creating walls of bullets that made direct attacks far more dangerous for the enemy. Pilots were trained to hold their position with extreme precision, maintaining exact altitude, speed, and distance from the aircraft around them. Even a small deviation could open a gap in the defensive pattern and expose the entire formation to attack. This meant that pilots often flew only a few meters apart, matching speed and movement for hours at a time. The physical and mental strain was enormous. Pilots had to focus constantly, fighting fatigue, cold, fear, and vibration while staring at another aircraft filling their windshield. Any sudden maneuver was discouraged, because one unexpected turn could cause a chain reaction throughout the formation. Weather made this even more dangerous. Clouds could hide nearby aircraft, while sunlight and shadows distorted depth perception. Anti-aircraft explosions shook the planes and forced small, involuntary corrections. In these conditions, flying close was both the reason crews survived enemy fighters and the reason collisions became possible. Protection and peril existed side by side, locked together in the same narrow space of sky. As the bomber formation pushed deeper into enemy territory, the greatest danger slowly shifted from enemy fighters to the sky itself. Weather over Europe was unpredictable and unforgiving, especially at high altitude where these missions took place. Thick cloud layers rolled in without warning, swallowing entire sections of the formation and forcing pilots to rely on instinct and instruments rather than sight. Inside the clouds, depth perception vanished, and a bomber that appeared safely distant one moment could suddenly emerge alarmingly close the next. At the same time, anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ground below, sending black bursts of flak exploding at the same altitude as the bombers. Each explosion rocked the aircraft violently, shaking control yokes and forcing pilots to make tiny corrections just to stay level. These small movements, harmless in open sky, became deadly in tight formation. The roar of engines, the constant vibration, and the sudden shock of nearby explosions overwhelmed the senses, while icy air crept into the fuselage, numbing hands and slowing reactions. Crews struggled to communicate clearly over radios filled with static and overlapping voices. In these moments, discipline was everything, yet human limits were constantly tested. A pilot could lose visual contact for only a few seconds before panic set in. When clouds broke and visibility returned, aircraft sometimes reappeared closer than expected, leaving no time to adjust. It was under these conditions that disaster became inevitable. A slight drop in altitude, a delayed correction, or a moment of spatial confusion could place one bomber directly into the path of another. In a sky already filled with machines, weather transformed order into chaos, turning the formation from a shield into a fragile trap waiting for a single mistake to trigger catastrophe. The collision did not happen with a single dramatic explosion, but with a horrifying sense of inevitability that unfolded in seconds. One B-17 flying fortress, already shaken by turbulence and flak bursts, drifted slightly off its assigned altitude. The pilot fought the controls, attempting to stabilize the aircraft while keeping visual contact with the formation. At the same moment, another bomber crossed behind a curtain of cloud and smoke, emerging exactly where no aircraft should have been. There was no warning shout, no time to dive or climb. The first sound was metal grinding against metal, a deep screech that cut through the roar of engines. A wing struck another wing, then slid, catching like a hook. For a brief, unreal moment, the two massive bombers were locked together in the sky, one appearing to rest on top of the other as if gravity itself had paused. Crews inside felt a violent jolt followed by an eerie stillness, as if the aircraft had frozen in mid-air. Instruments spun wildly, warning lights flashed, and engines strained under unnatural loads. Outside, fragments of aluminum tore away and vanished into the clouds below. Other bombers in the formation scattered instinctively, narrowly avoiding becoming part of the collision themselves. From a distance, witnesses later said it looked impossible, two aircraft flying as one twisted shape against the sky. That moment of contact lasted only seconds, but it shattered the illusion of control every airman depended on. In that instant, the carefully planned order of the mission collapsed, replaced by raw survival, fear, and the terrifying knowledge that the sky itself had turned against them. Inside both bombers, time seemed to slow to a crawl after the impact. The violent jolt threw crew members against bulkheads and equipment, while loose objects slammed across the cramped interior. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The familiar rhythm of the engines had changed, replaced by uneven roars and terrifying vibrations that traveled through the metal skin of the aircraft. Pilots gripped the control yokes with white knuckles, staring at instruments that no longer made sense. Altitude needles spun, airspeed fluctuated wildly, and warning lights glowed with urgent intensity. The flight engineer shouted damage reports, his voice fighting through engine noise and radio static. Gunners, isolated in their positions, struggled to understand what had happened, reporting twisted wings and pieces of the other aircraft frighteningly close. In the nose, the bombardier felt the aircraft tilt in unnatural ways, as if it were no longer obeying the rules of flight. Fear pressed heavily on every crew member, but training forced them to act. Checklists were half-remembered, shouted commands overlapped, and each man searched for reassurance in the voices of others. Some hoped the aircraft could still be controlled, that the bombers might separate and limp home. Others already understood the truth by the sound and feel of the machine. Structural damage meant the aircraft was dying. The cold at high altitude crept deeper as broken sections allowed air to rush inside, stealing breath and clarity of thought. In those frozen seconds, every man aboard confronted the same question, unspoken but understood by all. Was there still a chance to save the aircraft, or was it time to abandon the steel shell that had protected them until now and trust their lives to open sky and fabric? The pilots did not give up immediately, because giving up meant accepting that the aircraft was already lost. Every instinct pushed them to fight for control, even as the damaged bomber resisted every command. Control surfaces responded slowly or not at all, cables strained, and the aircraft shuddered as if protesting each movement. One wing had been torn and bent during the collision, disrupting lift and forcing the bomber into an uneven roll that grew worse with every second. The pilot adjusted throttle settings carefully, trying to balance the engines and reduce stress on the damaged structure. The co-pilot assisted, calling out instrument readings and suggesting corrections, both men working with intense focus despite knowing the odds were against them. The flight engineer monitored engine temperatures and fuel flow, reporting rising dangers as systems began to fail under abnormal strain. Outside, airflow ripped at exposed metal, increasing drag and pulling the aircraft downward. Attempts to stabilize altitude failed, and the bomber began a slow, terrifying descent. Radio calls went out, warning nearby aircraft to clear the area, while other bombers watched helplessly, unable to assist without risking their own destruction. For a brief moment, There was hope that the two aircraft might fully separate and that at least one could remain airborne. That hope faded as vibrations intensified and the nose dipped again. The damaged wing could no longer produce enough lift, and the aircraft entered an uncontrollable spiral. Every man aboard could feel it, the subtle but undeniable shift from controlled flight to inevitable fall. Training had prepared them for many emergencies, but not for this. The bomber was no longer a weapon or a vehicle. It had become a failing structure in the sky, fighting gravity and losing. In those final moments of attempted control, the crew learned a brutal truth of aerial warfare. Skill and courage could delay disaster, but some damage could not be flown through, only escaped. The decision came not as a dramatic shout, but as a heavy certainty that settled over the cockpit. The pilot looked once more at the instruments, then at the co-pilot, and in that brief exchange both men understood that the aircraft could no longer be saved. With a voice strained but steady, the command was given to abandon the bomber. For the crew of the B-17 Flying Fortress, this order carried a special weight, because bailing out at high altitude was never routine. Crew members moved quickly through the narrow fuselage, helping one another clip on parachutes with fingers stiff from cold and fear. Some paused only a second to glance at photographs tucked into flight jackets or to whisper prayers barely audible over the engines. The aircraft shook violently as it continued to lose altitude, making every step toward an escape hatch feel uncertain. Gunners left their positions, crawling through tight passages, while the bombardier struggled toward the nose hatch, fighting airflow that tried to pull him backward. Communication became chaotic, with shouted confirmations and urgent warnings as each man checked that others were ready. The first crew member leapt into the open sky, instantly swallowed by wind and cloud. One by one, dark shapes followed, disappearing beneath the bomber as parachutes snapped open far below. Each jump was an act of faith, a choice between the certainty of destruction inside the aircraft and the fragile hope carried by silk and cords. Above them, the wounded bomber continued its doomed descent, emptying itself of life as its crew scattered across the sky. Those final moments inside the aircraft were filled with fear, courage, and an unspoken bond, because every man knew that survival now depended not on machines or formation, but on timing, luck, and the mercy of the air below. After the last parachute vanished into the clouds, the damaged aircraft was left alone with gravity. No hands guided the controls now, no voices filled the cockpit, and no discipline held the structure together. The bomber, once a symbol of power and precision, became a wounded mass of metal descending through layers of cloud and smoke. Parts torn loose during the collision flapped violently in the airflow, ripping away piece by piece as speed increased. The engines, still producing uneven thrust, screamed until fuel starvation and mechanical stress silenced them one by one. With no corrective input, the aircraft rolled and yawed unpredictably, tracing a chaotic path toward the ground. Witnesses in nearby bombers watched in grim silence, unable to help and unwilling to look away. From their vantage point, it seemed unreal that something so large could fall so helplessly. The bomber emerged from the clouds briefly, revealing its twisted wings and torn fuselage, before disappearing again below. On the ground, civilians and soldiers alike heard the distant roar growing louder, a sound unlike thunder or artillery, signaling something terrible approaching. The impact, when it came, was violent and final. The bomber struck the earth at high speed, breaking apart in a violent explosion of fuel, metal, and fire that scattered debris across the landscape. Smoke rose quickly, marking the end of a mission and the destruction of a machine built to survive punishment. For those who had escaped moments earlier, the sight of the crash burned itself into memory, a reminder of how narrow the line between flight and death truly was. In the air war of the Second World War, loss was constant, but watching a bomber fall empty and broken carried a unique weight. It represented not only mechanical failure, but the collapse of control, order, and certainty in a sky that demanded perfection and punished even the smallest mistake without mercy. The men who survived the bailout carried the story of the collision not in photographs, but in memory, and those memories followed them for the rest of their lives. After drifting down through cloud and cold air, many landed scattered across unfamiliar territory, some injured by hard landings, others shaken but alive. For several, the ground itself became a new danger, as enemy soldiers or hostile civilians closed in before they could fully gather their bearings. Those captured were taken as prisoners of war, interrogated repeatedly about their mission, their aircraft, and the moment everything went wrong. Again and again, they described the same impossible sight, two massive bombers locked together in the air, moving as one broken shape against the sky. Their accounts were recorded in debriefings and intelligence reports, adding human voices to official mission logs that listed the aircraft simply as lost. Survivors spoke of the sound first, the grinding scream of metal, followed by a feeling of disbelief so strong it drowned out fear. Many admitted that until they saw their parachutes open, they did not believe they would live. In hospitals and prison camps, they replayed the event endlessly, wondering if a second earlier or later might have changed the outcome. When some eventually returned home after the war, their stories shocked listeners who struggled to imagine such chaos in the air. The crews emphasized that the aircraft, including the B-17 flying fortress, had been strong, but not invincible, and that survival depended as much on chance as on training. These testimonies transformed a brief mid-air collision into a lasting historical record, preserving not just what happened, but how it felt to face death suspended between clouds and earth. Long after the smoke of the crash faded, the collision between the two bombers continued to shape how air warfare was understood and remembered. Military planners studied the incident carefully, not to assign blame, but to learn how such disasters could be reduced in the future. Formation spacing, communication procedures, and weather protocols were reviewed with renewed urgency, because it was now clear that the greatest threat to a bomber crew was not always enemy fire. The sky itself could become a battlefield crowded with unseen dangers. For the men who flew these missions, the event reinforced a harsh reality of the Second World War air campaign. Survival depended on discipline, teamwork, and constant awareness, yet even perfect execution could be undone by forces beyond human control. The loss of the bomber was recorded in official histories, but its deeper meaning lived in the memories of those who had been there. Veterans later spoke of how that day changed their understanding of flight forever, stripping away any illusion of mastery over the air. The B-17 flying fortress, celebrated for its strength and endurance, became a symbol not only of power, but of vulnerability when human limits were tested at extreme altitude. Memorials erected after the war honored aircrews not for flawless victories, but for their willingness to climb into the sky knowing how fragile their safety truly was. The story of two bombers colliding in mid-air endures because it captures the essence of wartime aviation, where courage and catastrophe often shared the same narrow strip of sky. It stands as a reminder that history is not only shaped by great battles and grand strategies, but also by brief, violent moments when machines, men, and fate intersected high above the world, leaving lessons written forever in the sky.